business background that includes managerial and leadership roles in state government, health insurance, and renewable energy, she now leads in higher ed by emphasizing collaboration to catalyze strategic change. An active scholar and educator, Dr. Marciak has taught and consulted in the United States and internationally, and is an award-winning teacher, author, and leader. Actively working with industry partners, her research crosses boundaries to solve practical problems and enhance performance. Please welcome Dr. Erica Marciak.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here. It's a packed house. I don't think there's a single seat that was left unsold. This is Bob was saying that we might even break some records today. It's a sincere pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Annual Economic Forecast hosted by the Dragas Center for Economic Analysis and Policy in the Stroman College of Business. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to recognize some of our esteemed guests, colleagues, and partners in the audience today. ODU President Brian Hemphill and his cabinet, our elected officials and their representatives. Brian Stevens, did he make it here yet? Not quite? No, from the Chamber of Commerce. So many other business and organizational leaders. Thank you again for being here. Your presence here underscores the importance of collaboration, of academia, government, and industry partners working together to address the challenges and opportunities ahead for our Hampton Roads region. Thank you for helping lead that change. I'd also like to offer a special thanks to our esteemed sponsors. I won't have you going through claps, but in particular, our presenting sponsor, Dollar Bank. Your generous support makes this event possible. Thank you. Each year, the Dragas Center brings together data, expertise, and insights to offer perspective on the economic trends shaping our region, our Commonwealth, and beyond. This year, however, it's a little bit different. Humans are creatures of habit. I don't know about you, but you probably have a favorite parking space, a favorite seat on your couch. When I teach a class, I don't assign seats, but within that first week of the semester, I promise you, so students are going to start giving each other a side eye if someone's sitting in their seat. So all that to say, today, we need to forget a little bit of that habit. Today's forecast is framed by an undeniable reality of change. We're navigating a period of remarkable uncertainty and watching history unfold before us. Policy changes and shifting administrative priorities at all levels, local, state, national, and global, are occurring at an unprecedented pace. Bob and Vinod literally were changing slides probably this morning. These shifts influence everything from housing markets and workforce development to consumer behavior and business investments, and their constant flux challenges even our most seasoned experts to interpret what lies ahead, which is exactly why the work of the Dragas Center is so crucial. The expertise of Drs. McNab and Vinod Agarwal and their team allows them to analyze complex economic data and offer forward-focused guidance that's not just invaluable, it's absolutely essential for leaders like you. Today's presentation reflects extensive research, analysis, and thoughtful consideration of the many variables that impact the Hampton Roads economy, including trade, defense spending, tourism, and housing. But it also reflects a real-time analysis of the things that are happening right now. As business leaders, elected officials, and university partners, your engagement is key to translating these insights into action. By coming together in forums like this, we can all better prepare for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Today's event is just one more example of the critical partnerships and collaboration needed among our organizations and why, at the Strome College of Business, we are in the business of problem solving. This video will tell you a little bit more about us.
What's your problem? At the Strome College of Business, we're not afraid of problems. We embrace them. By considering the big challenges facing businesses, governments, and nonprofits, we're equipping Strome students to consider and overcome any problem. Our hands-on approach to learning prepares students for success by providing real-world experience in the classroom, internships and events that connect students with top businesses and organizations from across the region. Strome College of Business faculty members are industry experts, helping prepare our students for the problems still to come. Strome students live, work, and play within a rich coastal community of nearly 2 million. That's also rich in job opportunities across manufacturing, transportation, healthcare, government, military, and more. What's your problem? At Strome, we continue to empower our graduates to see every problem as an opportunity for growth. Join us at the Strome College of Business.
Thank you again for supporting today's event and the work that we do at the Strome College of Business and the Dragas Center. Before we dive into today's program, I'd like to once again recognize and thank Dollar Bank for its generous support of this event and the Hampton Roads region as a whole. I'd like to welcome Dave Paradise, the Senior Vice President of Dollar Bank. Let me read a little bit of his bio before he comes on up. He's a Senior VP of Dollar Bank's Virginia Division. David has been with Dollar Bank for 29 years and has risen to become a key leader. Previously, he managed the 170-year-old financial institution's Cleveland Retail Division until his relocation to Hampton Roads in 2018. Since arriving in Virginia, Dave oversees the overall administration of the division and has placed an emphasis on implementing the Dollar Bank's mission of being an inclusive community bank that invests in its customers, empowers its employees, and strengthens its community. He has devoted resources to fostering meaningful relationships with numerous community-centered organizations and believes it's important to give of our time, talent, and financial resources to best support the communities we serve. Please join me in welcoming David Paradise.
Thank you, Dean Marciak. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2025 Annual Economic Forecast. It's an honor for Dollar Bank to be the presenting sponsor of this year's program. As we look ahead at what the economic landscape might bring this year, gatherings like this remind us that staying informed, innovative, and connected is key to navigating challenges and seizing opportunities together. That's why we're here, to stand with you, to support you, to invest in the long-term success of Hampton Roads. At Dollar Bank, we firmly believe in the power of partnership. Our commitment to local businesses, entrepreneurs, and this incredible community goes beyond banking. It's about fostering growth, resilience, and opportunity, not just for today, but for the future generations as well. Dollar Bank is working hand in hand with businesses to create a lasting impact, and we look forward to seeing what 2025 holds for our region. Please enjoy this short video that highlights our dedication and the needs of our community.
At Dollar Bank, we are committed to being an inclusive community bank that is dedicated to investing in our customers, empowering our employees, and strengthening our communities.
Dollar Bank was founded in 1855 with the belief that banking should be for everyone. We have taken the same beliefs that we were founded on and we've carried them on through today. What makes us different is our mutuality. We have no stock, we have no shareholders. So this allows Dollar Bank to focus on our customers and businesses that we serve. But we're also a community bank, and that really allows us to get ingrained in the community.
Our opportunity to serve the community is the thing that brings us from 1855 to today. One of the things I think that sets us far apart is our ability to get out and speak to the communities about things that they need. The need is to reach out for financial literacy. The need is for you to provide us with a grant or investment so that we can grow this community and better serve the people in the community who have aspiring dreams or those that are just having basic needs not being met.
Since 2017, we've made a big commitment to be involved in the community. And it's our goal to serve the Hampton Roads community, unlike anyone else.
Our values of integrity, empathy, collaboration, inclusion, and community have provided us with steady guidance since 1855. Today, our unique independence as a mutual bank allows us to operate solely for the benefit of those we serve.
So now I'd like to introduce the speakers for today. Dr. McNab is a professor of economics and director of the Dragas Center for Economic Analysis and Policy. Dr. Agarwal is professor of economics and director of the ODU Economic Forecasting Project. So, in keeping with the theme today, I'd like to welcome these gentlemen with 6 claps, just 6. I turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and please do not expect me to dance to any more claps. My name is Bob McNab, and I'd like to thank you for coming here today. And I know there's a current of uncertainty, and some would say chaos and fear, governing a new administration and a new year. And in some decades, nothing happens, and in some weeks, a decade happens. And you may be feeling that today. But we're going to start off with some good news. Don't worry, I'll get to the bad news. But first, we're going to talk about some good news. And I will talk about the national and Virginia economies. Then my friend and colleague, Dr. Agarwal, will talk about Hampton Roads. And we will do our best to give you some insights into where we may go in 2025. And one of the things I would like you to understand is every forecast, every prognostication is built upon assumptions. And assumptions change rapidly. So anybody who says with certainty what exactly is going to happen this year is making some significant assumptions about almost everything. So with that in mind, and a thank you to Dollar Bank for that gracious introduction, and a thank you to President Hemphill for his continued support of the Dragas Center, I'd like to remind you that anything I say today is Vinod's fault. But in all seriousness, our opinions and commentary are on. They do not represent the Commonwealth of Virginia, Old Dominion University, its presidents, the Board of Visitors, the generous donors of the Dragas Center, and we will try our best to be objective and impartial in our analysis. If you have questions, we have a Q&A session at the end, and if you have disagreements, we're more than welcome to have that conversation. Please always feel free to reach out to us. So let's talk about where we are before we start talking about where we might go. Because if you don't understand where you stand, you really can't say where you might end up. And to do that, we have to talk about where we are at the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025. We have to recognize, and often we seem to have forgotten, that we had a historic economic shock in the spring of 2020. That pandemic-related economic shock seems to have disappeared from our collective consciousness, as if we jumped from 2019 to 2023 and something fuzzy happened in between. The kids were at home more, I was at home more, everybody was yelling at each other about internet time, but that's all that happened. But really what happened was a shock to the system that we thought would persist, much like the Great Recession of 2007-2009. And to our surprise, it did not. And in fact, the United States had one of the robust recoveries from an economic shock since World War II. And if we compare the U.S.'s economic performance with other industrialized countries, the United States has outperformed those countries over the last 4 years collectively. We have grown faster, we've grown more jobs, the growth has been robust and sustained and widespread. However, you might notice that there's a difference between the blue line, which is GDP, gross domestic product, the value of final goods and services, in current dollars, and the red line, which is inflation-adjusted GDP. And that difference is the cumulative effects of price growth, otherwise known as inflation. Perhaps you've heard the term. No? Well, we'll talk about it some more. Not only do we see this, we saw this repeated in Virginia, where Virginia saw an economic shock, a dip in the second quarter and third quarter of 2020, but then a sustained recovery. And in fact, if you look at Virginia's recovery in 2022, 2023, and 2004, the pace of economic growth was significantly higher on average than it was prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. In other words, the Commonwealth exited the pandemic growing faster than it did the previous decade, where we had somewhat anemic growth. That's good news, because now we are in the midst of an economic expansion where the economy at large has been growing for multiple quarters. And not only that, we have seen that Virginia's economic performance has essentially been equal to that of the United States. And how to read this graph? Well, first we say, okay, let's start at 100. Everybody's got the same value. How does the United States perform relative to Virginia? And you can see Virginia, by 2009, had grown 23.4% compared to 2000. The United States had only grown 16%. But by 2019, the two economies were roughly equal. In other words, the United States over the 2010s grew at a faster pace than the Commonwealth, representing the slower pace of growth in the Commonwealth in the previous decade. But if you look at the recovery after COVID, you see the United States and Virginia had grown at relatively the same pace, which is a reversal from the previous decade. And if you're taking pictures of the slides, they'll all be available on the website after the presentation. If you're taking pictures of me, I'm sorry. So if we continue this story, you might say, well, GDP is increasing. So what? That's just a broad measure of goods and services. So let's look at the civilian labor force, which is individuals aged 16 and over actively engaged in employment or looking for employment. And we can see there a significant shock from the COVID-19 pandemic, but a recovery. And recovery so much so that there's 4 million more individuals in the labor force in December 2024 than in December 2019. And in fact, you could see that what happened in 2020, that is approximately 1 in 8, 1 in 9 Americans were temporarily laid off. But now you can see 3 million more jobs than prior to the COVID-19 pandemic peak. So if one would say, has the U.S. recovered? It's not only recovered, we're in the midst of a new economic expansion. Job growth at the national level has continued to surprise not only economists, but investors on Wall Street and the Federal Reserve. Just remember, the Federal Reserve in September said the economy was weakening. We have to start cutting interest rates. And then job growth surpassed expectations. Everybody's like, well, that is not what we expected. And so the resiliency of U.S. businesses and the resiliency of businesses in Virginia has been sustained over the last 4 years, where we see a similar shock and a similar recovery in the Commonwealth, where now there's more people in the Commonwealth's labor force than prior to the pandemic and more jobs than prior to the pandemic. And so if we define economic expansion by continued job growth, we're looking at continuous months of job growth since 2022 in the beginning of the year. This, to me, is relatively good news. And so if we look at the performance of the two economies again, you can see the same story emerges. From 2000 to 2008, right before the Great Recession, job growth in Virginia outpassed that in the United States. 9% more jobs in Virginia, 6% more jobs in the United States. Prior to the pandemic, you could see that gap has closed. The gap closes because the U.S. is outperforming Virginia over that decade. Now we look at it and we see, oh, look, yes, a rapid shock. We could see the U.S. shock, but the Virginia actually still has more jobs created over the time span than the United States. That differential has been maintained by stronger job growth, slightly stronger job growth in Virginia. And we have to look at this with a longer-term view, because sometimes we're just caught up in the daily news cycle. And probably, if you were on Twitter, are on Twitter, migrated to Blue Sky, given up Reddit, now on Snapchat, moving to TikTok if it's still around, you're consumed with the immediacy of the now. You're looking at, oh my God, what has happened today? What has happened in the last hour? Everybody's checking their phone. What does the Wall Street Journal happen in the last 5 minutes? And we have to draw back and realize we are in one of the most fortunate periods in U.S. history in terms of economic performance. What do I mean? Well, let's look at the average employment rate in the Virginia and the United States by decade. In the 1980s, remember, this is the recession coming out of the 1970s and the Reagan Revolution and the Reagan expansion. The average unemployment rate in the United States was 7.3% over the decade. In Virginia, it was 5.2%. You can see that continues to decline, and then the effects of the Great Recession, you see it increase, right? So in the 2010s, average unemployment rate in Virginia was 4.8%. In the United States, 6.2%. Even including the pandemic economic shock of 2020, where the unemployment rate was in double digits, the average unemployment rate in Virginia and the United States is lower than it was in any of the previous decades. What does that say? It says broad-based economic growth with more people being employed during a recovery from a historic economic shock. Remember, the COVID-19 pandemic economic shock occurred in months. When we talk about the Great Depression, that occurs over a decade. So remember what I said, sometimes it feels like nothing happens in a decade. The COVID pandemic was essentially rolling a decade's worth of bad economic news in a couple months. And we came out of that more resilient and more robust than we entered it. And so we tend to forget that. When we are stuck with the tyranny of the now, we don't take a deep breath and go, we are more fortunate than our predecessors in terms of our quality of life and standard of living, access to technology, and so forth. But one might say, prices are higher. Yes, they are. But we have to, again, place this in perspective and ask ourselves, what is the psychology of inflation? Well, inflation is a measurement over the year-over-year change in prices. Well, first of all, we have to look at the behavior of inflation, and one can see very easily that the headline rate of inflation and the core rate, which is the headline rate minus food and fuel prices, accelerated in 2022 and peaked at 9% before decelerating as interest rates rose. But we also have to remember, it wasn't just a phenomenon in the United States. We have to remember this was a global synchronized shock to prices across the world. And the deceleration of inflation in the United States has been amongst the lowest amongst the industrialized countries in the world. In other words, yes, prices are still rising, but they're rising slower in the United States than many other industrialized countries, which suggests that a combination of monetary and fiscal policy coming out of the pandemic helped reduce price pressures. That does not mean that prices have not increased. And in fact, from a consumer perspective, there's a significant difference between going to somebody and say, hey, the rate of inflation is lower. Don't you feel better? Prices are only increasing 3% a year. Yay. And they go, yes, but they've increased 25% from January 2019, because that's what you feel psychologically, behaviorally, when you go into the grocery store and go, my 12-pack of soda now requires a second home loan. And so, yes, the monthly rate of inflation has decelerated, but cumulatively, we perceive ourselves as poorer off because we encounter prices more frequently and we adjust our behavior accordingly, even if our wages after adjusted inflation have outpaced inflation. Even if we are earning more income after accounting for inflation, we still feel poorer because we encounter prices more frequently than wages. But why do consumers feel this way? Well, let's take a look at the average rate of inflation again. Let's take a longer-term perspective. And again, you can see the impulse of inflation, average inflation by decade. 1970s, 1980s, where the headline rate of inflation was 7.1% in the 70s and 5.6% in the 80s, and then cooled dramatically in the 90s, 2000, and 2010s. And from the consumer's perspective, this was price stability. And price stability is a good thing because now you can expect what will happen in the future. And then the spike in inflation that happened, you can see, has meant the average rate of inflation this decade is double, if not more than double that of the previous decade. So from a consumer perspective, you're like, wow, things are not only more expensive, they're getting more expensive more rapidly. Let's place this in perspective. We could use a measure of dispersion, a measure of variability. Consumers hate uncertainty. Anybody watch the news over the last, month? Right? You want certainty, right? Just tell me what things are going to be so I can plan for them. Uncertainty creates poor decision-making because we become myopic. What does myopic mean? It means if you take my glasses, you could probably shoot down satellites with them. I am so nearsighted. But if we look at this measure of variability, which is called the coefficient of variation, if you want to know what it is in the footnote, you can see that over the 80s and 90s and 2010s, prices became less variable, especially core inflation, excluding food and fuel prices, because we're kind of used to fuel prices going up and down, up and down, up and down. But core inflation is at the lowest on average over the last 20 years, and then its variability doubles in the last 4 years. So consumers look at that and feel that as, I walk into the store and I just don't know what things are going to cost. It makes me feel poor and I'm just angry. People are nodding their heads going, I'm angry. Okay. Well, how can we measure that anger? One way to measure that anger is to look at a measure of consumer sentiment, where we actually ask consumers, the University of Michigan says, how do you feel about the state of the economy? And you can see from January 2020 down to April 2022, consumer sentiment fell in half. And in fact, you may have heard me say this before, that value consumer sentiment was the lowest it has been in the history of the survey, over 50 years. That American consumers felt worse about the economy in 2022 than during the Great Recession in 2007, 2009, and during when interest rates were above 15% in the 80s and 81. And then people are like, no, I don't believe that. Yes. Well, the interesting thing is if we look at the data by partisan affiliation, you see some interesting phenomena. You can see prior to around July 2020 when the pandemic hits, both Republicans and Democrats who responded to the survey said they had similar views about the state of the economy. Republican perceptions of the state of the economy were generally more positive than Democrats, where both were relatively strong. You can see that the red line continues to dip through the last 4 years, and you see a crossover and a more robust response by incentives. So it does say we have to acknowledge that our consumer sentiment data can be influenced by political affiliation and perceptions. So let's look at forward-looking expectations. In other words, now we ask consumers, what do you think things are going to be like 12 months from now? Does anybody happen to know what happened in November 2020 and November 2024? So we have to be careful with the data when looking at an aggregate, because people can look at the data and say, everybody thinks the economy worse, and it often depends upon where you stand. And so remember, if we go back a slide, when we ask voters, what do you think of the economy today? We have a marked difference. Given the same economic conditions, what do you think of the economy 12 months from now? We have a rapid evolution and change. So how do those expectations filter through the economic data is a good question for the Federal Reserve that's meeting today, because we are poised for growth. Everybody's like, I wasn't expecting this. The good news part of the expectation is that if there are not significant policy changes, then we would expect GDP growth to average at least 2.5% or more in the nation and across Virginia in 2025. Strong defense spending and federal spending across Virginia, it would likely be buoyed by recovering consumer sentiment in aggregate, and we would likely and hopefully see that H5N1 bird flu does not become rapidly transmissible like we saw a virus become in 2020. If that occurs, then we have a foundation for growth that is extremely, in my viewpoint, positive. More Americans are employed, more Virginians are employed, more Americans are in the labor force, more Virginians are in the labor force. Business demand for labor outstrips the available supply of labor. There are more job openings in Virginia than there are unemployed people. So if you're a business trying to hire, you're competing with a lot of other people. There are multiple jobs for every unemployed person nationally and in Virginia. But being an economist, I can't let you off without some other news. And you may have heard me talk about this before. The federal government's fiscal situation is unsustainable. This is not new information. That outlays, what we spend at a federal level, and receipts, what we bring in, have diverged. And have continually diverged in terms of changes in tax policy and expenditure policy over the last several decades. This is not the fault of one administration, one president, one Congress. This is a series of decisions adding up over time to make a gap such that we are increasing the amount we spend, and even though revenues are increasing, the rate of revenue increase is not keeping up. And so the gap becomes the deficit. And in 2024, our deficit was only $1.83 trillion. How many dollars is $1 trillion? I don't know, a lot. And in fact, the way to think about this is, in nominal terms, right, without adjusting for inflation, the deficit in 2009, in the midst of the Great Recession, where we had stimulus through TARP and other things, was still lower than the ongoing deficit during an economic expansion in 2024. So structurally, we have baked in a deficit. And then the question is, where does that deficit go? Well, you have to sell treasury bills, and somebody has to hold them. And this is continually going up, but through the third quarter of 2024, the U.S. deficit was approximately $35 trillion. If you look at foreign entities, those held around $8.7 trillion. The Federal Reserve had increased its holdings as part of its stimulus program in the 2020s and now slowly unwinding those. But why is this important? Well, back in 2019, before the pandemic, I used to say, by 2030, we may be at the point where we spend more on net interest on the debt than the Department of Defense. After the pandemic, I said, well, probably by 2029, we'll spend more on net interest than defense. We're doing that last fiscal year. Net interest is like, I have a balance on my credit card and I'm not even making the minimum payment. I'm just covering the interest. And here's the thing to consider. Over the last 4 years, whether you agree with the strategy or not, when interest rates started to rise, the Treasury Secretary changed the nature of Treasury auctions to roll into more short-term debt to lower the interest costs to the U.S. government. There are about $2 trillion, that's T, trillion dollars of treasuries on top of the regular borrowing that must occur, that must be refinanced this year into longer-term yields, which will be above 4% or more. Which means this likely understates the future costs of servicing the debt. Why is this important? Because now we're starting to see bond markets react. Perhaps you've heard me saying, I don't know when things are going to react. Now we're starting to get data. Why? Let's take a look at the blue line. The blue line looks at average Treasury yield changes prior to and after a Federal Reserve cut at the peak of a cycle. So when the interest rates are from the Federal Reserve are the highest, what happens to bond rates prior to the cut and after the cut? So think, markets are efficient, right? They see economic conditions, they say the Federal Reserve is likely to lower interest rates, bond yields start dropping in anticipation of that. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates, they look at the data and say economic conditions are relatively weak, the Federal Reserve is likely to lower interest rates again, bond yields fall in anticipation of the Federal Reserve decision. Make sense? Investors are forward-looking, they take on the data, they reduce what they ask in return for treasury bonds prior to the Fed's decision and after it. They're always ahead of the Fed. And in this time, in this cycle, we saw that behavior up until the Federal Reserve cut interest rates. We saw investors go, yeah, economic conditions appear to be weakening, we're going to start demanding less for our treasury bonds, yields will start to fall, and then they cut, and we completely diverge from the behavior of the last 4 cycles. That change is over 100 basis points. That is significant. What does that mean? That means previously investors like Federal Reserve is cutting rates, bond rates will fall. Now they're going, Federal Reserve cut rates, risk premium has increased, we're going to demand more to hold U.S. debt. Which means the interest rate costs in the future are only going to increase going forward. Now you may have heard, perhaps, of a decision by OMB to release a memo to say we're going to withhold spending on grants, over 2,600 grants and loans and other packages from the federal government. That is created chaos and confusion. We have to recognize that it did. The question is it legal? Well, that's for Congress to decide because of the Impoundment Control Act, which says, yes, the president can impound certain funds, but there's a specific way of doing that according to the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. I'm not going to get into that debate. But Congress is the only authority under the Constitution that has the ability to authorize and appropriate funds. And this is an argument of constitutional powers between the president and the Congress that I don't have the authority to solve. But let's ask who's vulnerable. So the Rockefeller Institute looks at what people pay to the federal government and what people and businesses get back from the federal government. In other words, what taxes do you pay and what goods and services and transfers do you get in return? If you pay more than you receive, you're a net recipient. If you get more than you pay, well, you're benefiting from your relationship with the federal government. In the top left quadrant, what do we see? Well, we see those states with lower than median household income in the United States and, for example, New Mexico received more than $2.50 for every dollar it sent to the federal government. Mississippi received more than $2 from the federal government for every dollar it sent. Wyoming's down here. Texas actually receives more from the federal government, about $1.12 for every dollar it sends. New York receives about 90 cents. California, about 88 cents. New Jersey, about 78 cents. Virginia, $1.80. So if we think about how the changing structure of federal expenditures could impact states, we have to ask who are the states that are benefiting most from the federal government. And Virginia, regardless of your perceptions of policy, is vulnerable to changes of federal employment and expenditure policy. So, start off with some good news, end up with a question mark. Where are we going? We don't know. We need to take a deep breath. We need to process information and realize there's a lot of difference between announcing a policy and whether an policy is actually found to be legal or not and enforceable. And that is part of we don't know. We do know some things, that if broad-based tariffs are announced, that inflation is going to rise. And so I know the Treasury Secretary has come out and said, we'll only raise tariffs 2% a month. The moment you announce tariffs, whether it's 10% or 25%, nobody cares about the schedule of how they're going to be imposed. They're going to rush to import goods and services and raise prices. How do we know this? Because it happened in December just in anticipation of potential tariffs, because that's why the trade deficit went up. Congress We don't know if they could extend the debt ceiling. We don't know if they could fully appropriate 2025. These are uncertainties that, well, the continuing resolution expires in March. The debt ceiling, we're in, the X factor land where everybody's asking the Treasury Secretary what the X date is. All these things are uncertain. Bond markets are anticipating higher term inflation. And really the wild card in this is H5N1. Does it just remain bird flu? Or do we have an outbreak? Because that is the wild card in the entire forecast if we're thinking about a worst case scenario. So you're asking, what's my forecast? I'm not giving you numbers. Because at the end of the day, any numbers are going to be heroically assumed about what's going to happen. And we just don't know what we don't know. But we should have the ability to take a deep breath, look at concrete policy actions, and move forward from there. Dr. Agarwal.
This is going to be a tough act to follow. 24 was in fact a very good year even for Hampton Roads. Actually, the last 4 years have been very good years. So when I talk about Hampton Roads, the first thing we'll talk about is defense spending. Why? As we said historically, 40% of economic activity in Hampton Roads is directly or indirectly dependent upon what happens to DoD spending. As Dr. McNab pointed out, defense spending is likely to continue to increase. These are the numbers we showed up last year. We expect the revised numbers to be even greater when they are shown here because new administration is likely to try to increase defense spending a whole lot more than what has been proposed here. If you look at Hampton Roads, on the other hand, you'll see two things. First of all, defense spending was flat from about 2011 to 17. We have been growing rather nicely, about 5% rate every year till 2024. And we expect again, just like national defense spending, the Hampton Roads defense spending will be beyond these numbers if the new administration succeeds in their budget plans. This flat DoD spending, you see, has significant impact on the performance of Hampton Roads economy. The red line here shows you GDP in constant prices, 2017 prices. We observe that from 2007 to about 2018, our economy was essentially flat. Two reasons. We had a flat defense spending and great recession. Since that time, defense spending has started to increase, and guess what it did to our GDP? It has also started to increase. There's one more piece of observation you should make from this one. If you look at the growth from 2021 to 2024, we had growth every year. 4 years of consecutive growth. Do you know when that happened last time? Early 2000, when we had actually 6 years of consecutive growth. If I was giving this talk yesterday, I would have said flatly, regardless of what happened in the economy, we are going to have positive growth in 2025. The news which is coming from Washington, D.C. about a pause in federal funding, spending cuts, a freeze or reduction in the federal workforce, it gives you a pause. We still expect a small positive growth in 2025, but don't count on it. It's beyond our pay grade. Let's talk about jobs and employment, and by the way, you're going to see almost the same trend as shown by Bob McNab. Bob should have pointed out, and since he didn't, I will, the jobs and employment numbers do not include active military employment. They do include federal civilian workforce. So numbers presented by Bob or by me do not include active military. These numbers don't look very different than the numbers we just saw for Virginia or for the United States. In a span of 2 months, 115,000 individuals lost their jobs, unemployed. Recovery has been good. Labor force has increased by about 20,000, and employment of individuals has increased by about 15,000. The gap between these two, by the way, the gap between these two numbers represent unemployment levels, and as you can see, these numbers are reflected very nicely in unemployment rates. When lots of people laid off, unemployment increased. At present, we seem to be where unemployment rate was just before the pandemic. What about jobs? These are individuals. What about jobs? If you want to look at February 2010 to February 2020, we gained about 67,000 jobs. Guess what the pandemic did? In 2 months' time, we lost all those jobs plus some more. We had a loss of 100,000 jobs in Hampton Roads. Recovery has been swift. It's been faster than most of the recession we've had in the past. Thanks to the fiscal stimulus and the easy monetary policy adopted by the Federal Reserve. And obviously, as we say, there's no such thing as free lunch. When you receive stimulus checks, when you get 0 interest rates, something has to give in at some point of time, and that's what we had to do with inflation. What this tells us very essentially is this. As Bob pointed out, if you look at GDP, look at the number of people employed, look at the labor force, look at the number of jobs, these 4 years have been very good years for Hampton Roads economy. 4 years of consecutive growth. Here's the problem. How do we compare to our neighbors? And guess what, guys? We don't do very well. All of these areas have seen more than a 10% job losses during the pandemic. Where are they now? They're eating our lunch. We simply are not growing as fast as many of these other areas are. Not only us, now Virginia is in the same boat, and so is Richmond. Area south of us has done very well. So I want to ask a question. Why are we so behind in Hampton Roads? There are 2 reasons. When we look at the fact that we are so dependent on military, it is very difficult for us to move the needle, so to speak. To be able to move up, we have to have a strategy. The strategy calls for a focus on growth. We need to be not everywhere, but selectively. Go Virginia has identified 8 clusters of potential growth. These clusters are where either we have a competitive advantage or we have potential of economic growth. Well, the nice thing about the 8 clusters is these clusters also have a very high average wage rate. So this is trying to boost the economy. Life sciences is a very good example of potential for growth, especially after the merger of ODU and EVMS. And we believe health sciences will continue to grow rather rapidly over the next 4 or 5 years. We thought clean energy would be a good area. There's offshore wind. We could probably have a cluster of firms coming in here to support this industry. But now we have a little concern it may not go as fast as we thought because some announcements made recently which you may have seen. Offshore wind is off the table. Only those projects will continue where permits have been issued and construction are in place. If leases have been signed, permits have been issued, they're being stopped. How long they will stay, we do not know. One other problem, which you may have heard, is called reduction of federal workforce. As of yesterday, plans are in place to give incentives to federal workforce to retire early. The question is how effective is going to be, what effect it will have, especially in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Nationally, 2% of jobs, of all non-farm jobs, are taken up by federal workforce. But if you rank these jobs as a ratio of federal jobs to total non-farm jobs by state, not surprisingly, Washington, D.C. ranks number 1, where 1 in 4 jobs is a federal civilian job. Followed in distance by Maryland, which happens to be number 5. But guys, keep in mind, where do these workers live who work in Washington, D.C.? A significant majority of them live either in Maryland or in Virginia. So any reduction in these workers' jobs will have a significant negative impact on the Commonwealth of Virginia. You remember what happens if you looked at metropolitan areas. Where does Hampton Roads stand here? If you look at large MSAs with a population of 500,000 or more, DC MSA is still number 1, followed by Ogden, Utah, and Huntsville, Alabama, and we are number 4. So we are wondering what the heck is happening in Ogden, Utah, and Huntsville, Alabama. Well, their population sizes are much smaller. Ogden, Utah has a total population of about 640,000, and Huntsville, Alabama has a population size of roughly 530,000. So what if you look at areas with a population of 1 million or more? Guess where are we? Number 2. Number 3 would be Oklahoma City. So we are very much dependent on these federal jobs. Any reduction in federal jobs, either through retirements or simply through reductions, are likely to have a significant impact on the job market in Hampton Roads. How much? I have no idea. Because it all depends upon where the cuts are and where these people live. Only time will tell. Let's move on to the port. If you were to look at the port performance and measure it through any indices like tonnage, TEUs, loaded TEUs, or what have you, you'll find year 24 was a pretty good year for the Port of Virginia by itself. Cargo tonnage increased and was an all-time high in 2024. Notice it had declined in 23 slightly. But one thing please keep in mind, the reason the cargo tonnage increases is because our exports have been rising every year since 2020. And the exports are heavier than imports. Loaded TEUs, on the other hand, also increase, but they are not as high as they were in 2022. So what happened in 2023 was very simply the following. Consumers have shifted the expenditures from commodities to services. So there was a decline in demand for imports. So the decline you see here in 23 was not just limited to Port of Virginia, it was all over the place, almost all the ports. Recovery at the Port of Virginia has not been complete, and you see, I'm going to show you the numbers of what is happening to all major ports. So let's look at, first of all, what happened in 2022 to 2023. The all the major ports in the United States. Except for Houston, which is basically based on oil, Port of Virginia did rather well. Yes, there was a decrease in cargo, decrease in TEUs, but we did much better than, for example, New Jersey, Long Beach, Savannah, Oakland, and Seattle. The question that we ask ourselves is, how are we doing in 2024 compared to 2022? Ports on the West Coast have recovered completely, except for Oakland. Ports on the East Coast have yet to recover. But again, notice here, Port of Virginia had the smallest decline compared to New York, New Jersey, Savannah, or Charleston. So port has done quite well. Investments in the port are paying off. And as a result, what has happened is our market share on the East Coast ports has actually increased. So port has done quite well relative to other ports. Now the question that I've been asked several times is, what is going to happen in 2025? We have a big challenge, big worry, big uncertainty called tariffs. So before I show you the tariff situation here, let me be very direct and straightforward. I'm an economist. I teach this in Econ 202 class. Maybe I've been taught wrong. Maybe I'm teaching wrong, but here's what we know. Tariffs are collected in the port of entry of the cargo. They're paid by the importer. They're never paid by the exporter. And oftentimes when tariffs are raised, importers will try to pass on some of those tariffs to the consumers in the form of higher prices. How much higher depends upon elasticity of demand and supply. Regardless, tariffs will lead to be paid by us, whether you're a consumer or importer, and prices will rise. And there's several other consequences of this. But let's look at what is happening in the Port of Virginia. If you look at Port of Virginia, the two nations which lead the pack in the form of imports are China and India. 25% of our tonnage of imports is coming from India and China. President Trump has been saying, he hasn't done anything as yet, that we will be imposing tariffs on China and India. And when they do it, nothing has been done as yet, so please don't blame me as yet. The volume of imports from these two countries will decline simply because prices will be higher. These countries in return are likely to retaliate by imposing a tariff on U.S. exports, which will lead to reduction in our exports to overseas. So what this tells us is, very simply, if you go with the tariffs and high tariffs, prices will rise, and cargo at the Port of Virginia and at other ports will decline. How much? When? Depends upon size of the tariff. Depends on the tariffs are being imposed on commodities, or on countries, or by ownership of the firms. Again, nothing is known at this time, so I refuse to forecast the cargo tonnage for 2025 for the Port of Virginia. Your guess is as good as mine. So one of the pillars of the economy is tourism, or hotels. Hotels obviously were affected the most by the pandemic, just like your brick-and-mortar retail stores. How bad was it? Hotel revenues in 2020 in Hampton Roads decreased by 36%. 36%. They decrease almost everywhere in the world, by the way, not just here. However, 2021 was a better year for the hotel industry. If you'd asked me in 2020, can they recover in 1 year? I said, heck no, no way. Hotel industry not only recovered all its losses, they got 9% more revenues compared to 2019. They continue to do so very well in 22. The rate of growth has not been as fast in 2023 and 2024, but let me show you what is happening in various sub-markets in the U.S. 29 to 2020, almost every major market shown here and every major market I know of had losses revenue exceeding 30%. Look at Northern Virginia, 62% reduction in revenue. They were dependent mostly on commercial and business traffic. What happened in Williamsburg? Williamsburg happened to be the first area in this Commonwealth where the first few cases of COVID-19 were announced. Williamsburg in April 2020 compared to April 2019 lost revenue by 95%. The industry did quite well in 2021 and 2022. Actually, by 2022, almost every one of these markets except Northern Virginia had recovered completely. It took Northern Virginia 2024 to fully recover. Simply because business traffic, commercial traffic, conference traffic, convention traffic is not still the same as it used to be in 19. So one question we ran into is, what has caused this recovery? If you really look at the last column, 2019 to 2024, in almost every major market we have revenues increased by double digits. These revenues, in our opinion, have increased for the wrong reason. It does not speak well for the health of this industry. The revenues have increased simply because hoteliers are able to charge higher rates. If you were to look at demand for rooms as measured by rooms sold, in almost every one of these markets, rooms sold have been either flat or negative. So hotel industry cannot simply continue to increase rates and expect a better return in terms of revenues. The challenge here is, how do you increase visitation to area? They also have a challenge from something called Airbnb and Vrbo. People do have options. If hotel industry continues to raise rates, guess what alternatives consumers are likely to look at? Maybe Airbnb, maybe Vrbo. So let's look at how these two firms have been doing. Airbnb and Vrbo revenues were $110 million in 2018. By 2024, they more than doubled. And most of the revenue they're getting from them is not coming from a room in the private home. It's coming from something called whole house rentals. People renting the whole house, not renting a room in the house. So if cities and localities want to regulate the short-term rentals, they better focus on whole house rentals and don't waste your time in trying to rent private room industry. That is where most of the revenue is. Also, there are not many cities and counties, even in Virginia, who are regulating these, which means people are renting houses on Airbnb or whatever, and they simply are not paying taxes. We call it illegal rentals. The easier you make it to regulate them, the more tax revenue the cities will collect. The last piece of the puzzle I've been talking about is the housing market. If there was a sector which was largely unaffected by COVID-19, it was the residential housing market. Buyers, sellers, real estate professionals quickly adjusted to the market conditions, and they went on Zoom. No more open houses. Not in person. As a result, housing prices have continued to increase. Look at housing price increases by each city, by 8 major cities in Hampton Roads. They increased by 9% in 2020, despite COVID-19, and 9% in 2022, so 2021. And since then, housing prices have continued to increase, even though at a smaller pace. If you were to look at the level of price increases, from 20 to 2011, median housing prices have been increasing every year. The pace has picked up since 2020. Median house prices in Hampton Roads today are 20% higher than they were in 2021. At the same time, sales have declined by 36% from 2021. By the way, in 2024, we actually had a very small increase in sales of existing homes, 0.5%. So sales have been falling, prices have been rising. Tells me it's a seller's market. If you want to look at month of supply, I'm showing 2 time periods here. At present, we have less than 2 months of supply in the marketplace. We have a similar phenomenon in early 2000. But at that time, the supply increased, the month of supply increased simply because supply of homes in the marketplace was increasing faster than demand. Now we have a very different problem. We have a supply problem. There are not enough houses available in the marketplace to sell. Why do you have a supply problem? This tells you everything you want to know. Mortgage rates. We all were getting used to these low mortgage rates. In 2020, mortgage rate was 3.11%. As beginning in 2021, I said mortgage rates would never be that low. And guess what? I was wrong. In 2021, they fell to 2.96. Anyone of you who owns a home and bought a home prior to 2022 probably had a mortgage rate of less than 4%. Because you got to refinance, and a mortgage. So mortgage rates rise when they're rising. It affects both demand and supply. As mortgage rates rise, some potential home buyers simply don't qualify for mortgage loans anymore, so they simply drop out. And second and most serious one is the fact that those of you who own these mortgages at 2 or 3% or 4%, you are reluctant to move. You don't have property rights to those loans. You can't carry those mortgages with you. You have to get new loans at higher rates of interest. Therefore, they're reluctant to come to the market, to bring the home to the marketplace. Therefore, supply is limited. Another factor that plays a role in supply is new construction homes. Back in early 2000, 1 in 5 homes used to be a new construction home. Guess what is happening? We are simply not building that many homes anymore. In 2024, 1 in 11 sales was a new construction home. And that builders are simply not building, and this has been creating a gap in supply not just this year, but the last 15 to 20 years. They're not building homes. And even if a building gets where we're building, we are building homes outside of 8 major cities. Lots of them. Back in 2014, 1 in 7 homes sold, new construction homes sold, used to be outside of 8 cities. Now 1 in 4. So why are we going to these outside cities and counties? Two reasons. One is cost of land. And second is zoning regulations. In a recent study done by Agarwal, we show about 3 slides, which are repeats of what we said in the State of Region presentation in October. But these 3 slides are still very important. According to a survey conducted by National Association of Home Builders, found that when they develop a multi-family complex, as much as 40% of the cost is associated with regulation costs. While this may be biased somewhat because the survey was conducted by National Association of Home Builders, it may not be relevant here, but what is relevant here is it tells you that regulatory cost is a significant cost. We have regulations which are probably correct in 70s. We keep adding more and more regulations without realizing what is no longer needed. We need to act on reducing these regulations. So the builders are encouraged to build more homes. In a recent study in Minnesota for Minneapolis, for example, they found after these land reforms, in Minneapolis they were able to increase supply of homes by 12% due to land reforms to encourage construction of new homes, both single and multifamily. Rents in Minneapolis increased by only 1% as opposed to 14% in the state. Homelessness. Most of us think of homelessness as people who have no income. People who have income, who can't afford homes, they're also called homeless sometimes. Homelessness decreased in Minneapolis by 12%, whereas it increased in the state by 14%. So if we increase supply, we can help. Another study showed if you build more multifamily homes, the rents actually decrease. Look at Austin, Texas, Raleigh, North Carolina, Jacksonville, Florida, and Nashville, Tennessee. All have seen recently decreases in rents. So where are we? I'm also going to give you a number this year for forecast, because these numbers are meaningless. Not knowing what is going to happen, maybe by June we know more. We should be able to address some issues. But here's what we think where we are. Defense spending will continue to provide a boost for Hampton Roads economy, at least it won't slow it down. Home prices will continue to increase. We expect sales to stabilize as people get used to this current 7% rate. But those of you who are around, you know what the rates were in the 1980s? 16, 17, 18%. I bought a home I own in 1985, assumed a loan at 12%. I thought that was a good deal. Hampton Roads, this is a challenge we want to offer to everyone in the community here. Hampton Roads needs to develop a regional housing strategy. I know HRPVC is trying to do something on this. And move towards uniformity in zoning regulations across cities and counties. Allow high-density housing, mixed-use developments, and reducing regulatory burdens that increase the cost of housing. Doing so will not only increase housing supply, it will also help us spur economic growth. Workers need housing. If we don't have housing in the major cities, we are sending them across outside of Hampton Roads or to adjoining cities and counties. And finally, as Bob pointed out, unsettling in Washington, D.C. is a major problem. When it comes to Hampton Roads, two things are more important than others. One is what happens to the federal workforce, and second, what happens to tariffs. Thank you very much. We'll take any questions you guys might have.
Vinod, I have a forecast update. You think I'm joking? 2 minutes after I got off the floor, OMB rescinded the spending reduction memo. So, I'm just giving you an update. You could say,
Therefore, I can say, I expect positive growth in GDP in 2025.
in all seriousness, it probably means the memo is going to be revamped and rescoped, and there's going to be a continued fight over the Impoundment Control Act and whether or not the president can rescind funds on such a large scale without congressional approval. But the chaos and uncertainty on how to comply with such a broad-based memo is one of the reasons we saw some things stop and some things not stop, and at least that uncertainty is tamped down for at least 24 hours maybe.
See, Bob was able to look at his telephone when I was going to talk.
Well, now you look at your forecast.
It doesn't matter in there.
We do have about 20 minutes for questions. Almost never happened before. We have microphones in the back, and our amazing graduate student assistants will help you get the mic. Just raise your question.
I don't need a mic.
Raise your hand.
A quick question on the hotel revenue. Is that just increasing rates, or is there also, like, I've noticed when we travel now, they don't clean the rooms, they don't change stuff, they reduce their staffing quite a bit.
The revenues indicate room revenues only.
Okay?
There are we do not know what is happening with cost of the hotels. I'm sure they're finding labor costs are going up. I'm sure they're finding labor short.